All right, so I think it's been about a month since George Janko left the Impulsive podcast, and Mike and Logan have been pretty quiet about it. I don't think they've even mentioned that he left. I don't think they've addressed it at all. I don't think they've talked about why he left or anything like that. And the only time Logan has really mentioned him recently was when he was trashing him, and they censored his name out, but everyone knows who he's talking about.
I love this outlet. I love this outlet, and it exists because people watch. And without people watching, I just have a show like
And by the reaction, it sounds like even Big Mike and his sister thought that Logan went too far here. So then soon after this, George basically confirmed he's who they're talking about. He put out this tweet. He said, "To the Impulsive fans, I'm so sorry I can't speak about things. Not my choice. I do love you guys, and for those of you sending me the clip of them talking shit, it's all love. And I've already moved on from that toxic environment." So I'm sure Logan was not happy about this tweet. But what does he really expect? I mean, if you're not going to mention why this guy left or even the fact that he left, and then you're just going to start trashing him on your podcast, I would expect him to be kind of pissed about that, and I'd expect him to respond. And it's also ridiculous that it sounds like Logan made him sign an NDA, so he can't even go into it too much. And also, there's another episode of the Impulsive podcast where Logan took a subtle shot at George. And of course, he didn't mention his name, but he was talking about how if you leave the podcast, then you can clickbait a video talking about why you left and use that in the title, and it gets a bunch of views. And of course, George did do that when he started his podcast. I think before he left Impulsive, but the writing was on the wall. And, of course, George is going to use that as clickbait. Anybody would. I think Mike would definitely do that for sure. I mean, just look at the clickbait he currently does on his channel. I mean, this guy has no shame. He doesn't care.
And I'm just doing this for a couple weeks so then I could leave and clickbait that why I left Impulsive.
That's good. It's a good strategy.
That'll crush.
It's been done. It's been done many times, and it works.
By who? Oh.
Well, you can make a real living for yourself. We've seen the model. We've seen the model work. You do something. You stick with it. You leave. Make it a thumbnail.
It's a crazy game. It's a crazy game.
So I just think it's weird that Logan will say stuff like this, but then not just directly acknowledge the fact that George left. And maybe it's because he knows if he would start talking about it on the podcast, he'd probably get worked up because it sounds like they are not on good terms. Even though in that tweet, George tries to kind of make it sound like there's nothing between them and it's all good. But it's clear it's not all good, and they definitely had a falling out. And even in that tweet, George is making it seem like it's all love, but he has taken some passive-aggressive shots at them. He's calling it a toxic environment, which, I agree it probably is. And also, he's saying that Logan made him sign an NDA pretty much. So George is kind of taking some shots back at them, but also at the same time, he's making it seem like he's taking the high road, which is a smart move that I'm sure really pissed off Logan. People are already talking about that video of him trashing George. And then once George confirmed it and tweeted about it, the story got even bigger, and it makes Logan look pretty bad. So I'm sure after that, Logan hates him even more. And you can just tell towards the end of George's time on the podcast, Logan was getting so sick of him. Since the Bobby Lee thing, since George walked out of that podcast, Logan has just been fed up with George. And also you could tell he got really annoyed by how much George likes to talk about religion, and him and George would even get into it sometimes and it'd get pretty awkward. And I don't know if George was always like that on the podcast, but towards the end it seemed like he's just talking about that more and more. I saw this tweet criticizing George. They said, when you joined Impulsive, you knew the type of podcast it was. You knew Logan and Mike. You knew the type of people they were. Then you wanted it to change and you wanted it to be a church prayer for Jesus. So I wonder if Logan knew that George was this into religion when he first asked him to do the podcast, because it seems like Logan really doesn't like talking about this kind of stuff and hearing about it, especially on the podcast. Maybe he thought it'd be interesting to have a different perspective, but it just got to be too much for them. And it is also possible maybe Logan knew he's religious, but he didn't know how seriously he took it. And then throughout the podcast, George just started taking it more and more seriously. And it's clear that's one of the things he wants to talk about the most. And he just doesn't fit in very well with Logan and Mike. And I also saw Mike was asked about this during a live stream recently. And of course he couldn't comment on it, but Sneeko was there and he said it's because George was too Christian.
Not Impulsive anymore. Is that you don't answer that?
He's too Christian.
No, I don't want to talk about that.
Okay.
Yeah.
He didn't go to the ritual in the basement.
Yeah,
he refused.
That's what it was. Bro, what? I still don't know. I still haven't seen anything about this ritual.
And also, I'm sure George didn't approve of Mike and Logan's lifestyle at all. He probably thinks they're selling their souls to the devil, promoting the crypto scams to kids, promoting gambling to kids. Mike's 40 years old, always hanging around adult film stars, using them as clickbait in his videos, and I'm sure he's partying all the time. So I think George probably saw that and was freaked out by it, and maybe that made him even more religious. And I'm sure he thought he could probably change them or something. That's probably why he talked about it a lot on the podcast. But Logan and Mike are not interested in hearing about that. And sometimes it was an interesting dynamic. You know, it'd make for some good drama, and sometimes they'd get in some arguments about it. But then also sometimes George would be talking about like Jesus or something and just get so carried away with it.
She goes, hey, Adam is blowing up your phone. The guy who works, you know, from the chiropractor place. And I answer the phone. He's dripping wet, bro. Like he just got out of the shower. He goes, bro, I got to tell you something. He goes, whatever you're doing, Jesus told me to tell you that he loves you. And yes. And I'm like, what? I go, why did you just say that? Belle put her knife down. I go, buddy, back up. Why did you say that? He goes, I have no idea what's going on. I'm in the shower because that's why he was wet. He goes, I'm praying about my family, my friend. He goes, 3 times in my prayer, God interrupted me. He goes, go tell George whatever he feels in his heart is right. So I go, whoa. The next day, I'm standing here on the podcast.
And I'm sure Logan's doing whatever he can to try not to make fun of that story. So I think the religious thing was a big part of it. And then also a lot of people talk about how just the third spot in that podcast is a tough position, you know, because you're usually on the other side of the guest. Like the guest is always just facing Logan, and it's hard to get involved in the conversation. So whenever a guest was on, George usually just sat there pretty quiet, and then the guest would make fun of him sometimes when he did chime in. And also, I know George is trying to be a stand-up comedian, but he's just not very funny. And even the jokes he says, of course, it has to do with religion.
Hold on, you ain't gonna ask me a question? Oh, damn.
He waits.
So
I'm so sorry.
Now you gotta say something. Man.
Listen, man, I read the Bible a lot when they talk about David and Goliath. I've never seen a giant, and so like I'm literally just I'm a little taken.
You've been sitting over here for 30 minutes, and that's all you can freaking say.
And the same kind of thing happened with Bobby Lee when George walked off. So, you know, the combination of that seat and George just not being the funniest guy and not really having the same chemistry that Logan and Mike do, it was just not a good combination. And Mike's sister actually defended him a little bit when she was on the podcast, like that clip I played earlier. During that podcast, she brings up how that seat is a tough spot.
I know you put me in a bad seat, and I have to turn to ask questions.
Are you saying that the 3 slot is a bad
It's
seat?
a
And that
horrible
whoever
seat.
sits in that...
Listen to him. Just don't listen to him.
I
He's
never
bullying.
do.
He's bullying.
He is a bully.
And I think they've had 3 different co-hosts in that position, so it's obviously not going very well for whoever sits there. And I'm sure George got sick of that position very early on, but it helps his career out a lot, so he just has to put up with it. But now he's moved on to Brendan Schaub and Brian Callen. He's hanging out with that group, which I don't know if it's much better than Mike and Logan, but at least George just has his own podcast and he makes appearances on theirs. It's not like they have to co-host anything together. So maybe just in small doses, they won't get on each other's nerves, but we'll have to see. All right, so that's about it for this video. Thanks for watching. Make sure to leave me a comment. Let me know what you think about all this. And then make sure you check out my Patreon. And there's a lot of content on there at this point. And I just posted a video about a comedian who recently stumbled upon one of my videos and completely agreed with me. And then I also have videos about the downfall of Milo Yiannopoulos and Michael Richards, you know, Kramer, his meltdown at the Laugh Factory. So there's a lot of stuff on there. Make sure you check it out. And then hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and I'll catch you at the next video.